Hi everyone, and welcome to the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, London and South East Region's virtual First Thursday event. We're really delighted to have Louise and Morris, who will be speaking on major donor fundraising, 7 tips to work effectively with senior volunteers. My name's Stephen. I'm one of the committee members for the London and South East. And I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you to all of our volunteers who are working for the committee. We're all dedicated to promoting excellence in fundraising, and it takes a great team to put this together. Just a few housekeeping things. We are currently recruiting for a number of positions at the moment. So if you are interested in joining us, please feel free to direct message me or get in touch. We're currently looking for a treasurer, a marketing lead, and a events coordinator to help support these events. So if you consider joining us, we're a very friendly team. Please do message me or contact me on LinkedIn. My name's Stephen Vickers. So yes, great. Also, the major donor SIG group will also be recruiting for a number of volunteers as well. So if you're interested in that, I will share with you Michael Winehouse's details shortly after the session, and you can feel free to get in contact with him directly yourself. And there's also a list of volunteer opportunities on the CRF website. So anyway, back to today's event. Please do tweet about us. We'd love to hear from you. So Louise's handle is @Summit Fundraising, and ours is @CIOFSE London.
Stephen, sorry to interrupt. Mine's @Summit Fundraise SE on the end. That's all right. I think fundraising was too long for the handle.
Absolutely. Thank you, Louise. That's really helpful. So please use the correct one @Summit Fundraise, please. Really appreciate that. So we are recording this morning's event. So please anonymise yourself if you wish to do so. Obviously, your cameras will be off anyway, so that's no problem. Finally, also I'd like to invite you to join the Institute Fundraising as a member if you're not already. So just for attending this session, we can actually offer you a discounted rate. So if you are interested in joining, please do. The discounted rate gives you an absolute whopping £49 off your first annual membership. You'll have access to discounted rates, future events, including fundraising convention, training courses and qualifications, as well as members-only guidance and direct support from our policy team. So if you are interested, please do let us know. The code is LDN, /group, and I will post that in the chat shortly for you as well. It's also available online. We will be running some questions short towards the end of Louise's presentation. So if I could ask you to all put your questions into the Q&A function. So any questions you have throughout the session, please add them. And at the end, we will try to ask as many as possible for you. So I'll hand over to Louise now. So just a little bit of background on Louise. So Louise is a major donor specialist, consultant, coach, speaker and trainer who has helped over 100 charities raise more large gifts. She has over 15 years major gift experience in charities, small, medium and large. She's a former fundraising director herself and a trustee for a small international development charity. So Summit Fundraising is Louise's organisation. It's named after Louise's love of mountains and is now how Louise works with fundraisers and charity leadership, helping them build better relationships with donors, raise more larger gifts. She has a distinction in a certificate in philanthropic psychology and regularly interviews philanthropists. So please feel free to get in contact if you can use any of Louise's service too. So Louise, over to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks everybody for joining today, and thanks for the lovely intro, particularly getting philanthropic psychology out, which is a bit of a mouthful to say the least. So today's session, I'm going to see if I can just get the intro slide up, is around 7 tips to work with your trustees and senior volunteers. Now, some of you might be doing some of these already. What I'm very much hoping is that there might be a few things that you can take away, regardless of what stage you're at on your major donor fundraising journey. So I'm going to try and make it really practical. And you'll actually find that there is a lot of crossover if we think about it, whether we're talking about trustees on your board or whether we're talking about senior volunteers or on a development committee. There are lots of things in common. And I've been there and I've had a few, if not disasters, maybe not as positive experiences as it could have been. And working with a lot of different organizations now, it comes up a lot. It can be really tough. So if you're in that position and you've got frustrations or it's not quite happening as you would like, you're not alone. So at the end, the 7 tips, I've got a list of them with a couple of notes around them, and you'll be emailed that afterwards as well. So first tip, be clear about what help you would like. And I think often in our psyche as fundraisers and fundraising leads, we just need our boards to help fundraising and to help with major donor fundraising. And well, we want that development committee because we need to raise more. But actually, what does that look like? What specifically do you want people to be doing? For example, when we're talking about specifically what you'd like them to do, if it's a development committee, have you actually got a role description for that member? That if you want them to open doors to their networks, you're really explicit about that. Sometimes we shy away from it. And I've inherited a development committee who wanted to do events, as in fundraising events, galas. That was not why they were set up, but we'd had this kind of mission drift. And to have those difficult conversations early and to say to people, this is why we want this committee, and this is what you'd like to be doing. We'll support you with it. You know, we'll work with you with how you want to work to introduce people is so important, because if you don't have those conversations early, you can really struggle. And yes, Mario, you will receive the slides at the end. So being clear about the help you need for a development committee or trustees. And with trustees, actually, that will inform who you approach. So the second tip is you don't need your whole board or your whole committee completely at their A game for major donor fundraising. And I know that sounds really obvious, but if we've done the first step, which is really think, what do we want to achieve here? Do we want somebody actually who can network really well at events, who can tell the story of the charity? Do we want someone to introduce their contacts? When you've defined that, your second piece is just acknowledging that your whole board of trustees won't necessarily be helping in that. And it's one of the things I hear again, and I've been guilty of it. Kind of, we talk about, oh, the board don't get fundraising, or the board aren't very helpful, the board aren't well connected, you know, my committee aren't opening their doors. And if we can break it down to actually the individuals, what we normally find is that there isn't an organization I've worked with who doesn't have at least one trustee who is maybe senior in the world of work, who is particularly influential, or is just moving in circles at a different level. So it's around having those realistic expectations, because this is tough. And if you are trying to get 9 trustees opening their networks, you will fail. And one of the things in philanthropic psychology, I've managed to say it again, that I've learned from studying with Jen Shang and others, is that if we can just reframe things about having realistic expectations of fundraisers, it can really help us feel more motivated along this road. So if it's a case of you've got a development committee and there's 7 people on it, and yes, maybe 1 or 2 of them may be disengaged. You know, we've just gone through a pandemic and they may have other stuff going on in their lives. And yes, you can try and re-engage them, but that would probably be as I'd expect. But there might be 2, 3, 4 people that you think they are really my focus. And if you can actually have a realistic target, which is, you know, this next 6 months, I'm going to work with these 2 trustees for them to give them confidence, to get to know them so that they are more likely to open their networks. That can make it really manageable all of a sudden, rather than let's get the whole board opening doors to major donors. So that's the second tip, is just really being realistic and not just thinking of your trustees as a board or your group of senior volunteers as a committee, but breaking it down to individual people. The third tip is really to get to know the senior volunteers you want to work with as individuals. And again, this might sound really obvious, but as some of you will be getting back to face-to-face events, you know, are some of your trustees mingling at the beginning, at the end? Can you go and have a chat to them, particularly the trustees who you know are going to be valuable for major donor fundraising? How can you work with them? So getting to know them is really interesting. And often we think, oh, this trustee is difficult to get hold of, or this trustee is not that involved. What I've done with a lot of organizations I've worked with is they've asked them for a virtual coffee for 20 minutes. And most of the trustees have said yes. So as trustees, I'm a trustee and I know some of you are as well, you normally don't undertake it lightly. We can from afar judge and they're not very active or they don't this, but they will have their story on why they're involved. And I was coaching a head of fundraising who really wanted to work with 2 specific trustees to encourage them to open their networks, but she was quite worried about one of the meetings in particular. She didn't know the trustee that much. And I said, well, you know, what do we know about the trustee? Why did they get involved to start with? And she said, I just don't think we've ever asked that question. Ask the question. It's exactly the same kind of questions you would ask major donors externally. What's their connection? What's their passion? Where are they coming from? And I talked about those kind of conversations. With major donors, we know that when we have more conversations, shortly more good things happen. We get to understand where that donor is coming from, or potential donor. Maybe it's not them that give, maybe they can introduce us to somebody else. And having those conversations is a really important part of raising large gifts. And I think we can translate that to senior volunteers. So if you've inherited a committee or you're working with a committee, how many one-on-one conversations have you had with those committee members? And how can you try and secure that and make it really easy for them? So is it, you know, a 20-minute coffee? If they're local to you and they're happy to meet face-to-face now, could you go and have a face-to-face coffee and have a chat? Because what you need to be doing, and what I found can really help, is adapting to how they want to be involved. So again, I've felt really frustrated in the past when I've been busy and I haven't properly thought about it, that, oh my gosh, you know, they're not inviting their networks. And I work with a lot of fundraisers like this, that they want their trustees to be more involved. But part of getting to know them as individuals is getting to know how they want to be involved and what they're comfortable with. One of the trustees on the board that I'm part of is very well connected and was extremely successful in business, retired early. And there's a sole fundraiser in that organization. And the trustee has been really clear with the fundraiser. I am happy to invite some of my contacts to events. I'm happy to have a meeting, the 3 of us, but I'm not comfortable asking for gifts. They're my acquaintances, they're my ex-university friends, it just doesn't feel comfortable me asking for money. That's fine, because when you know that, you can work with that individual. I've interviewed and trained so many trustees, and some trustees, when they think more broadly, actually, I do know some people have said, I'll host something. I'm going to host a dinner and invite these people around, because that works for them. They're really comfortable in their own space. They want to introduce a charity to them. Other trustees just will not be, and senior volunteers won't be in that zone. And maybe they would want to attend a meeting with you. People can be really protective of their contacts, remember. So I've had some trustees who've opened up a meeting with an individual and the fundraiser has got that meeting, brilliant, but they want to be there as well. Other trustees and senior volunteers, not as bothered. I'll kind of set you 2 up, I'll speak to them, I'll secure the meeting and I don't need to be there. All of these feel really subtle, but they're so, so important, because we're talking here about people's networks or people's confidence, even if they're not introducing their networks and their events. It's really important. So that's the third tip, which is really trying to get them to know them as individuals and being really accepting of how they can help and how they're comfortable helping. And I often think it's taken me quite a while frankly, to kind of not judge. And the way I look at it, if people aren't comfortable with some of this stuff, a lot of us, we're professional fundraisers and we're not always comfortable with this, right? We're just not. It can feel uncomfortable. And when you take that into a sphere of, it can feel uncomfortable thinking about asking for money, and then you take that into a sphere of people's own contacts, what can you do to make them feel more comfortable? How can you listen to them and understand where they're coming from? Which kind of leads on to the fourth tip, really. So first, we've already had be clear about what help you need as the first tip. Recognize you do not need your whole board or your whole committee 100% in your major donor program. It's not realistic to have that. The third tip was get to know them as individuals. And the fourth is to take it away from the money, which sounds so counterintuitive because I've been there and I know what it's like when you're under huge pressure to raise more. You've maybe got some existing major donors or a number of them if you're further along, and you think, where next? Well, trustees networks, we've got this development board that we've set up, or this committee that we've set up. We want to raise more through it. We need to raise more. We've got this target, or we've got these services that we need to do. So I'm really acutely aware. But if we go in thinking about the money, because of that concern I talked about, it can just completely throw trustees and volunteers' involvement. Now, not for everybody. Some people are really blunt. I've been at a dinner with a major donor and he's basically said, who are the big hitters here? Who do you want me to chat to? I'm already donating. I get it. That's fine. But not everybody is in that space. And often when you're starting to work with some of these individuals on introducing their contacts, it can be really tough for them if they think, which is what a lot of trustees I train do think, they've come from a place of, oh my gosh, the fundraiser or the organization is asking me for contacts, and are they going to ask me to ask them for money? Oh gosh, everyone becomes uncomfortable. Lots of people very uncomfortable with this. Or worse, they're going to go and ask them for money. And, you know, they don't even have a relationship with them. This is my contact. And all of this really prevents people from opening up. So I have had a fairly awkward session when I was director of fundraising, and we were under a lot of pressure for a capital appeal. And I've gone into the board and I've said, you know, who do you know who's high net worth, who could give more? You know, this is all our responsibility. Come on, everyone. You know, let's write the names down. Didn't work that well. If it has worked for you, brilliant. But it didn't work that well. So instead, if we can think about, instead of who do you know who could give a major gift, who do you know who might be inspired by what we're doing? Who do you know who cares about what we're trying to achieve? Who do you know who would want to achieve this change, this justice, what we're trying to achieve? So, for example, the International Development Charity I'm trustee of, we're starting to think about, okay, so we're working in Ethiopia. Who's lived in Addis? Who's got that connection? What is that connection to the work that we're doing? And that can just reframe it for trustees in a completely different way. And it can make them more comfortable. Now, you might think, well, actually, then will we actually get any high net worth individuals? If you're speaking to the right trustees, because you've identified the ones who are better connected, or if you're working with the more proactive development committee who understand that their role is on these introductions, you will get somewhere. And you can talk about how we want to increase the number of connections, we want to increase ultimately the number of donors that we have. But in the first instance, this is about a conversation. This is about understanding where they're at and how they might be inspired to do more. And that can really reassure people. And I've seen that a lot. So I interview a lot of philanthropists and we talk a lot for charities, and we talk a lot about what's their thoughts on the charity, what's their feedback, where are they coming from, and then go on to thinking, well, do you know anyone else who might be inspired by this? You're giving your time for free. Who else do you know who might be inspired by what we're doing? And many of them are quite open to that, because it's not about, we need your contacts to give money. So there is that subtlety, which might just help some of you if you're finding a bit of a brick wall with some of your trustees when they're thinking about their connections. So that's tip number 4, try and keep it away from the money, particularly to start with when you have a stronger relationship with a senior volunteer, and particularly if they have a more blunt style, then it might not be right, but in a lot of situations it could help. And tip 5 is really make it easy for your senior volunteers to help. So I was coaching a fundraiser the other day, and she has got a trustee, and they've had a number of meetings. He's really involved with fundraising, and he's talked about, yeah, I think, I'd be happy to introduce you. Nothing's happened over about 6 months. And I know this is quite common. What can we do to help our trustees? For those of you who are old enough to have seen Jerry Maguire, which is a Tom Cruise film from the 90s, he has this moment where he's just in exasperation going, help me to help you. And I often think our trustees are doing that, because I've heard from them, what do you actually want me to do? And this trustee is a prime example. The fundraiser was saying, well, he said he's going to help. And I said, how do you think he wants to help? Well, I opened up the conversation and he didn't really come back with much. Well, then what can we go with? What can we go with to make those introductions really easy? So for an example, a couple of the charities that I've worked with said, we'd like you to invite 3 people to this event. I'm a trustee or a development committee member. And all of a sudden I'm thinking, well, I can do that. That's a specific task. And it feels easier than, can you go and ask your contact for money? Or can you kind of bring them to a virtual coffee with the CEO? Because I'm thinking, I don't know if that's kind of enough. How do I broach that? So how can we make it easy for our senior volunteers to help us with our major donor fundraising? They are busy. We are all busy. They might not get back to your email. And what can we do in between meetings? Some of you will know this if you've worked with committees before, but that's where the real work happens. So you're in a committee meeting, the senior volunteers said, yes, I'm happy to invite 3 people to the event, or I'm happy to introduce you to these people that I know. And then it's 3 months to the next meeting, and you're thinking, how can you work with them outside of that meeting? So for example, I've had a trustee open up and said, well, I wanted to introduce the charity, but I'm just really worried I'm going to get asked a question I don't know the answer to. And, she was very high up in business, and she just didn't want to be put in that position. Remember, your trustees aren't operational down in the weeds. They don't know as much as you as a fundraiser. So what we did is we put together an FAQ document for her of the things she was most likely to be asked, to give her that confidence to start those conversations. Often many of you who do cultivation events to inspire donors and to get them more involved will know that feedback from trustees in the room is really important. So they may have had some really valuable conversations, but what has been said, if they've spoken to a potential donor, how will you know what that next step might be? They had that conversation, not you. And often I've seen individuals and fundraisers say, right, you're coming to this event. This is the brief, trustees who are coming. This is the timings. And what we'd like you to do afterwards is we'd like you to fill in this form of the conversations that you've had and send it back to us, or at least send us an email. It's just not going to happen with some trustees, because we know that their lives are busy. Maybe they're more forgetful. I have walked before from a dementia event at number 11 Downing Street to the Tube with a trustee talking to me as he went on the way home, because I knew he was not going to email me the next day. he was really keen. He wanted to get his train back straight after the event. So I went with him for 10 minutes and said, oh, who did you chat to? How did it go? How do you think, from that conversation, did they mention coming on a visit? Did they mention this? Because that's what worked for that trustee. So there's lots of creative ways that you can make it easy for your trustees. And part of that is what we said before, is kind of knowing them as an individual and being really specific about what you would like and what you need. So for example, if it's corporate introductions, you might be looking at a completely different intro to if it's inviting people round for dinner. But similarly to a major donor fundraising, do think about specifically asking, because sometimes that will of and that breadth and that vagueness of introduce somebody is just not enough for a trustee to take action. And I often think in between meetings and working with senior volunteers is what I call kind of helpful nudging. We do have to be on it, and they are busy and they may have committed to something and it may not have happened. So I think as long as we can, rather than chasing, as long as we can approach people with a really helpful attitude of, giving them a call. I know you mentioned in the last meeting that you were going to introduce us to so, or that you were going to send the invite out to a few people. I know you're really busy. What do you need from me to make that happen? How can I help? And it's that kind of partnership working that can help sometimes when things have stalled. Now, I'm not saying it always works. We know some trustees might go off the radar for a little bit, but it can also give you a bit of confidence to chase, but in a really positive way. And when I've done that before, and when fundraisers I've coached, one particular one, I did that and followed up in between a committee meeting and said, you mentioned some introductions. How can I help? And the trustee said, I just love a 2-pager about the charity. I just feel if I had that when I send this first email and then I follow up when I see that person next, it's just going to really help me. So the 2-pager goes across. But if you don't ask, you don't know. And don't assume your trustees or your committee will come to you and say, this is what I need. Some will, but some won't. So that's tip number 5 about making it easy. Tip number 6 is really that internal piece about building your profile and the knowledge of major donor fundraising. We know, I know a lot of you have been through this pain more than any other type of fundraising. There are a lot of myths around major donor fundraising. Well, it must be a 6 or a 7-figure gift, even if you've got a fledgling program with few connections. That's the expectation. Time is often a real, how quickly gifts come in is often a real myth. Well, we've been working on this for 6 months and it's not working, so let's disinvest. I see that quite a lot, sadly. So it takes time, but if you want senior volunteers and trustees to work with you on their relationships and on your program longer term, they need to be aware of those expectations that yes, it can take a long time to build the relationships. And how are you going to reassure them that major donor fundraising is on track in the meantime? So I talk a lot about different KPIs for major donor fundraising, because it isn't just about the money. And that's easy for me to say because right now I don't have a target on my shoulder, but it's about conversations. And I work a lot with Bright Spot and Rob Woods. And a lot of what we do is how can you get those conversations? Why? Because it breaks it down away from the target. And a gift, and a large gift, might be a long time coming. And actually being able to monitor the number and to be able to say to your trustees the number of conversations or engagements that you've had is a really positive way of saying we're on track. We wanted to have 4 meetings a month with high net worth individuals, and we are, or we're aiming for 10 meetings a month. And that's why your introductions as trustees and senior volunteers are so valuable, because this is the vital part, is the conversations and getting to know people. And so then we will succeed and we will get more gifts if we can have those introductions and conversations. So you can use it 2-way to reassure on what you and your team, if you've got a team of major donor fundraisers, is doing, but also to give that shared accountability. Because again, then it's breaking it down and you're not saying to a trustee, you need to help me raise $500,000. Some are okay with that, many aren't. What you're saying is we're aiming for 10 meetings each month, and we think we're probably about halfway there with the people we've got in mind in high net worths, but we'd love you to bring more people to the table, either through inviting them to this event we've got coming up or through having an initial conversation. So managing expectations, I think, is just so important. And when I've done training with trustee boards around major donor fundraising, and a lot of them really aren't surprised. They've got the fundraising pressure often as well, but they're not surprised that it takes a while. They're not surprised it's based on relationships. They're not surprised that you really have to understand where they're coming from, rather than kind of ram giving down their throat and treat them as a piggy bank. As one woman said to me, who was kind of leading a lot of business forums up in the Northeast, she just looked at me and was like, well, this is what I do with all the women in business I work with. So it's sometimes taking that time to make the parallels with their world as well. I spoke to a trustee the other week, which was really fascinating. He was in wealth management, and he was like, how you're managing these relationships and where you're trying to lead us with the processes, Louise, is exactly what I do. And we had a great exchange of ideas on what he's doing with his high net worth clients, and how the charity I was helping could actually implement some of that for their major donor relationships. But it is important to have that conversation to manage those expectations, because otherwise it makes your job so much more difficult. And I know it's not one conversation, and I know it's not easy, but that can help the engagement of your senior volunteers. And to build your reputation across the organisation, that doesn't mean there's only one person, but I'm working with a charity at the moment where one of the trustees just isn't really clear who his point of contact is, and there's kind of 3 different levels of fundraisers working, and he doesn't have that kind of trust and relationship internally where he would feel more comfortable introducing his contacts, and most importantly, finding out what's happened to those contacts. So again, if we're putting ourselves in our trustee's shoes, if they've introduced a foundation to you, which he had, and then they've given, if that was my contact at the foundation, I'd want to know that they'd given, and I'd want to probably thank them myself as well as the charity. Now that sounds quite basic, and some of you will be like, well, of course I'd do that. If the trustee made the introduction and then we got a gift, of course I'd let them know. But sometimes we don't, because we're busy and we don't necessarily find the headspace. And actually, it builds me on to my last point, really, which is treating some of your senior volunteers as if they are major donors, even if they're not giving at that level, and taking that thought on what are the points where they will want to be connected to the difference they've made. In this instance, this is quite amazing, right? There was a 5-figure gift from a foundation for a medium-sized organisation that they otherwise wouldn't have got. And actually, letting the trustee know that is really important. And the 7th tip is really to use the skills you use with major donors all the time, because they're so relevant. Yet sometimes when we're a bit more internal with trustees, we kind of forget, and sometimes those frustrations can be a bit more real. But all of the stuff I've talked about, a lot of you are being like, well, yeah, I do that. And I suppose the challenge is, how can we make the time to do that internally with our boards and trustees, to have those conversations one-on-one, to develop their relationships, to follow up in between the meetings, to really think about where they're coming from and what would make their life easy. Because you've got all the skills in your team or that you're doing already. And that curiosity, which is so important with major donors, rather than we need networks, where are they coming from? What's their connection? And if we can step away a little bit from that money and be really curious, it takes a bit longer. Doing 2 meetings with trustees, and so we had a couple of sessions beforehand, and I said to her, well, how did it go afterwards? She said, I really enjoyed it. And that's what this is about, particularly after the last 18 months, whether you're meeting virtually or whether you're meeting in person, getting that joy from connecting with people, whether they're external donors or trustees, is hopefully a part of the role that you love. And taking it back to a curious step means nearly always with charities and fundraisers, whether it's for the trustee or externally, there's that enjoyment, because you're finding out about someone And that is a fascinating part of the role and a privilege that you have. So, Mike, if you're happy to put the slides on, I'll just wrap up on the 7 tips, and you will get these afterwards as well. As I said, I'm sure you're doing some of this already, but I hope there's 1 or 2 things that you might be able to take away and put into practice. There's some weird animation on the first slide, so I don't know if you're able to just get all the 4 tips up. That would be great. I don't think I can drive. So tip 1, just be really clear about the help you need and why. If you want to be opening doors to corporates, you're going to be working with different trustees and different senior volunteers, to if you want people more present at events. Second, you don't need your whole board. So please don't be put off if you think, my board's not very well connected or they're not really helping. Rather than thinking of the board or the whole committee, think of the individuals. Tip 3, get to know them as individuals. Really, if you can understand and appreciate their world, what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with, what's going on for them outside of work. Are they trying to travel more now post-COVID? So will they be more difficult? Would it be more difficult for them to be involved face-to-face, etc.? Just understand that if you can. And 4, take it away from the money, which feels so counterintuitive when you've got a big target, but it can really help. And rather than who do you know who could give a major gift, instead, who do you know who might be inspired by the difference we're making, or who do you know who might want to see this change that we're looking for? And tip 5 on the next slide is really make it easy for them. Trustees and senior volunteers are not perfect. None of us are. They're busy. They might not get back to you. But that kind of helpful nudging, I call it, in between meetings, can really help keep the momentum, and asking them what they need. What do you need from me? Tip 6 is just trying to build your profile internally to make sure that there's that confidence when introductions happen, that they're being kept in the loop and that they can see progress. We know major gifts is a long game. So in terms of a committee and your trustees, how can you give them confidence through KPIs like the number of engagements, the number of meetings, that you are moving in the right direction? And tip 7 is to use your major donor skills. It's remarkably similar, but sometimes we don't necessarily think of it like that because they're feel more internal, whether it's a development committee or whether it's your board members. So if you can take the time to develop the relationships, it should mean you're raising more large gifts, but actually that also you enjoy the process and that you're really enjoying working with your trustees and senior volunteers as well. So thank you so much for listening. And I think we're going to come on to questions now.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Louise. It was like amazing to hear you talk through all that, and your passion for it really shines through. So thank you. And we've got quite a few questions. So I'm going to start off with one from Adrian, which says, one of our development board members is brilliant and knows so many people in the world of private trusts, but hates the idea of approaching personal contacts. We're happy for him to stay in his wheelhouse, but he brings a lot of that fear and negativity into our committee whenever we are discussing major donor contacts. How do we respect his preferences, but also try and keep it from derailing the conversation as a whole?
Yeah, really tricky one. I mean, you might have tried this already. This is the hard thing on a webinar, is we can't have a two-way, but I would be inclined to be speaking to him separately and have an honest, genuine conversation. I think sometimes they feel a bit scary, but to say, you know, when we've talked about it in the meetings, you know, there is some negativity in the room. How do you think we can get over that? Where are you at? And what can, you know, this committee, it also depends on the framework of your committee, I would say, Adrian, but if part of that is introducing people, you know, this was the idea of the committee, that this would happen, what could I do to help you with that? And again, coming at it from that kind of helpful, curious point of view, I've had an experience just the other week, really similar, introducing a chair who was like flat against any kind of introductions. And it happens, but I think I would suggest taking it out of the main meeting and listening, just asking some really open questions to try and understand where he's coming from. And if your brief around the committee is to open doors and he doesn't want to, maybe he wants an excuse to step down. You know, I think it's just that kind of that one-on-one approach might get you a bit more understanding.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And we've got another one this has been posted anonymously, but it says, do you have any tips for forming and working with committees, specifically in capital campaigns, as it moves from a quiet to more outward facing phase?
So this is about a capital campaign that you've had, so a committee for the outward phase. Is that, Vicky, what I'm understanding? So, I mean, I haven't worked on a capital campaign for 3 or 4 years, I'll be honest, but certainly from my experience when I have done, it comes down to what are you using your committee for? And again, which I know it sounds really basic, but I've worked with committees and seen real value actually on the quieter part of the appeal. So the brief being, we would like more conversations with corporates, with high net worth individuals, with trusts and foundations. How can you help us to have those conversations? What can we do together? And that's pretty much the reason for the committee. So I would say, think about what you want to achieve. If it's a case of actually, this is the more public facing stage, and we would like a committee to help us in the community, get the word out there, get more community fundraising, you will be looking at different individuals on that committee and different people. So I think go back to your aim. There are a huge amount of work development committees, and I have, with a number of charities I've worked with, recommended they don't do one, because if you can get to your aim in another way, you might not even have to have a committee. And I don't have broad evidence to back this up. I certainly have a lot of anecdotal evidence that a lot of people who might be on a committee, particularly if they're high net worth, they don't want to sit in another meeting. So actually, you could get some really great peer-to-peer fundraising going without a committee. You could have 2 or 3 really invested trustees or existing donors who are opening their networks, and you don't need that committee structure. So it's not to say never do one, but I would say think about the aim. It will inform if you do have a board or a committee, and who is on that and who you want to be on that. And if you've already done that work, apologies, but sometimes we're so quick in our thinking because we're busy. It's worth taking a step back. And I would say if you're a bit further on and you have done that thinking and you want to go for one, I think it's having those open conversations early with the people on the committee, in terms of you don't want them going to plan events for next spring and balls if actually that's not what you want them to be doing, and why you want them to be on the committee.
Perfect, thank you. And we've got one from Jessica. It says, what criteria would you recommend using to identify potential major donors from our existing database, rather than ask trustees to help? For example, we have X amount one-off, X amount regular gift, and over X amount from giving history. For context, we have a small database, under 1,000 supporters, and rarely receive individual gifts over 3 figures.
Yeah, I mean, Jessica, I've worked with quite a lot of charities in this situation that don't necessarily have a huge database and a huge number of individual givers. I mean, you could well screen all of them. So well screening, some of you will know this and will be doing it, but is legal if you can do it within GDPR. And this isn't a GDPR session, so we won't go into it, but there are some things that you will need in place if you are going to well screen. But what that gives you is who could give a larger gift. What somebody has given isn't an indication of what they will give. And that works both ways. I have phoned somebody who gave a £20,000 gift to a medical research charity, and to say thank you, and had a quick look at, because it was in the privacy policy, we could, where they lived on a council estate in Wales and it was a windfall gift and they've come into some inheritance. That doesn't mean that donor is not going to be thanked and really connected to the difference they've made, but they're not going to go into the major donor pool for another large gift. And it can work the other way, that somebody might give you £500 but have the ability to give you 50 grand or £500,000. And wealth research enables you to understand that potential. So if I was you, Jessica, was it Jessica? Yes, I would be kind of doing a piece of wealth research, getting everything in place to be able to do that within GDPR, because it will almost scope what your potential is from your existing donors. And if there's a lot of potential there, you might want to focus on that. But if there's less, you're going to need networks far more, because it's existing supporters, volunteers, donors, and it's networks that are the 2 places where you're likely to get more large gifts.
Fantastic, thank you. And we've got one from Jolie. So it says, hi Louise, thanks for this talk. Do you have any tips about initial conversations with trustees around introducing fundraising? I work for a college and we're right at the beginning of introducing fundraising and asking for support from our senior connections like our governors, which will be reframing their role somewhat.
Yeah, really interesting point. I mean, I do a lot of sessions with trustees, and the one thing I nearly always start off with is giving's good for people. I mean, it really is. And when we think less about asking and more about giving people the opportunity to change something, and something that they might care about, it gives it a very different dynamic. So I think there's something about setting up the positivity. And, you know, the IOF had a Proud Fundraiser campaign a few years ago, and bringing that to your non-fundraisers and to your governors, because that can also set the scene for what I was talking about earlier, which is, in the first instance, this isn't going to be about money. This is going to be about us having a conversation and understanding if, you know, how can we inspire people by what we're doing? How can we understand how they might want to be involved? So that's kind of initial thoughts. And I think you could probably do that. And I often do it as a group, but then I think those kind of one-on-one is important as well. If you've got a particular few governors that you think they're going to be really pivotal here, I would be getting those one-on-one coffees, either in person or virtually, and really understanding a bit more about them and where they're coming from.
Perfect, thank you so much. And we've got another one that's come in anonymously. How can you gently encourage your executive director to be more inspiring to your trustees?
Gosh, there's a lot of pressure on your executive director to be inspiring, but no, I'm joking. I kind of know where you're coming from. So it's really hard, as I said, because this is one way, not two way. I'd love to have a conversation, but I think there's two things. Is it inspiring? Is it effective in terms of giving them confidence to be involved? And I think it's probably thinking, where do you want your trustees to be? Do you want them to have more confidence? Do you want these two trustees to be introducing their networks? As I said at the beginning, how can you like break it down? And then how do we get there? And is your executive director actually struggling with that? Have they got less knowledge of this? Or could you have a conversation with your executive director? Again, that helpful. I'm really keen. I don't know what your role is, but if you're in, you know, the major donor fundraising space, I'm really keen that we can work with some of these trustees. How can I help? I'd be happy to have some one-on-one conversations with them. You know, we're very hierarchical in charities. A lot of other organisations have extremely senior roles with about 4 less levels in them. And sometimes that's to the detriment of, you can only go and speak to a trustee if you're at this level. In major donor fundraising, it turns it on its head. You know, if you're operational in major donor fundraising, you need to be having those conversations directly. So I think that's one thing that you could think about. But, you know, respecting what your executive director has got going on as well. And there may be a reason it might not be a priority on their list because they're looking after all of fundraising, or they've got a wider portfolio. Maybe actually working with trustees and major donor isn't top of their list, or as I said, maybe they don't have the confidence to be doing it. So I've been in frustrating positions internally. I'm not saying you are, but you might be. And again, if we can take it back to curiosity of like, okay, why maybe did they do that in that meeting? What was their thinking? If you've seen something that you think is uninspiring, or what can I do to help? It can sometimes help you to see a little way forward.
Amazing, thank you so much. And we've got one from Rebecca here. It says, how can we introduce the concept of anti-racist practice in fundraising with major donors?
Yeah, really good question. I'm white. I've had a lot of white privilege. I've worked in a lot of majority white fundraising teams, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot over the last year. I wrote a blog on it, which Vicky, I can send you the link to go out with the slides a few months ago, having spoken to Michael in Bernardes and a number of other leaders who have started to implement some of this just anti-racism practice. A few kind of brief tips is making sure it's in your values as an organization. That might not be in your gift, but hopefully your organization is moving to become anti-racist. And if not, do you want to be working there, would be my question. I know job hunting is not fun, but hopefully it's in your values, or you can talk about how it's a key part, and introducing that in conversations with donors. So you bringing it up, you know, don't wait for a foundation, for a donor to be saying what they're doing. It might not be on their radar. It really might not. So I think we can just be having those conversations when we're introducing our charity, and We've got, you know, anti-racism focus, particularly for the next year, because we want to accelerate change by doing X, Y, and Z. Another idea I heard when I was chatting to different charities, which I loved, was actually if you're having anti-racism training as an organisation, inviting some of your donors or potential donors along to it. That could work both ways. Maybe if they're leading a large corporate, they're doing anti-racism training and they invite you along to it. And also recommending other causes. And I think that is the hardest thing sometimes when we're so kind of in our own organisations. But Davinia Batley at Become, she's doing some brilliant work, and their anti-racism work is properly ingrained into their strategy, and they know it will take time. But one of the things they're looking at are who are the people of colour-led organisations that they can refer to funders and donors, lifting them up, because they probably don't have, a lot of person of colour organisations don't have the same networks and the same access to these pots of money. So I certainly don't have all the answers, and I'm not an anti-racism expert, but that's just some thoughts.
Amazing, thank you. And we've got a question from Sanyivan, which says, I have a small development team, me and a start of career officer. Our fundraising subcommittee is newly formed with the new trustees. They were clearly recruited by the chair with an indication that we are looking for introductions and to build networks. For the first 2 meetings, they have only wanted to share ideas about how we should be fundraising. The ideas are high investment and low or no return, e.g. business club or membership scheme. What can I do to move the conversation to networks and intros? And I'm just going to say, Louise, I think this will need to be sort of our last question, but what I will do is email the other questions over to you. When you have some time, if we could potentially get some responses out to the rest of the attendees.
Yeah, that's fine. It might be in a couple of weeks. I'm going on holiday at 12.
No worries.
But just, yeah, I'm more than happy to do it when I'm back, but just in case anyone thinks I've forgotten. I mean, gosh, I really empathise. It's really tough. I think those, again, coming at a point of curiosity and putting yourself in their shoes, it's uncomfortable. And my guess is they're largely uncomfortable at how they introduce their networks and introducing them. Maybe there's something around there, as I was saying, that they think it's going to be all about the money, and that feels uncomfortable. A lot of things I hear from trustees and donors is, well, my contacts, they've got their own charities, you know, I don't think they've got, I don't really want to talk to them about this one. There's all of that that's wrapped up. I think in this instance, from what I know, which isn't that much, I would be taking it outside of the meetings again, because otherwise that cycle is just not going to break. And it's really hard when you've got, you know, maybe some assertive voices and influential people going completely off track, or let's put this event on. And I've so had that, because people don't want to do the introductions. So I would say to move conversations to networks and intros, start off, if you've got a chair, with your chair of that fundraising subcommittee. And again, that genuine, open, honest conversation of, this is what we were hoping to achieve, wasn't it? And it's not quite playing out like that. I don't want to waste the charity's resources on doing really low return. You know, as trustees, you don't want to do that, on doing low return activity. We know if we can get more introductions, how can we start to change that? What do you think you need for me to help you do that? We've got, and then the specifics, because sometimes the specifics are lacking for them. Opening contacts, opening networks is so broad. What are you actually asking them to do? And when we can get down to that specifics of, I'm asking you to email 4 people and then follow up on the phone, or I'm asking you to send the invitation, rather than it coming from the charity to our event, to 10 of your contacts, you've actually tasked them with something, and that can help break down that that barrier, I would say. So just a few thoughts, but good luck with it. It's not easy.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Some really useful tips there. I'm going to pass back over to Stephen to wrap up the session, but thank you so much for your questions. And yeah, we'll endeavour to answer them when Louise has got back from her holiday.
Thank you very much, Louise. That was great. Thank you for all your time, and I hope you have a great holiday. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Just a reminder that the next IOF, COF First Thursday is on the 2nd of September, which will be focused on corporates. So I hope you could all join us then. Just a reminder about recruitment. If you do want to join this committee or the major donor group committee. Some information will be mailed out to you later. Want to wish you all the best until we see you next time. And thank you once again, Louise, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great time for the rest of your week.